If you're on a fixed income, a shortage doesn't just mean inconvenience. It means choosing between paying more or going without. And for seniors especially, some of these items aren't just nice to have. They're the difference between managing a rough patch comfortably or struggling through it. There's one item on this list that older households have historically been caught without, and it's rarely the one anyone thinks of first. Stick around, because number one may surprise you. Grocery bills don't feel the way they used to. Even people who've been managing a household budget for 40 years will tell you the math doesn't work the same anymore. A cart that used to cost $60 stretches past $90, and it's not always the big ticket items driving it. Sometimes it's the small things, the ones nobody thinks to budget for. Part of that comes down to transportation costs. Fuel prices ripple through everything, from the truck that delivers groceries to the plastic that packages them. When shipping gets more expensive, it shows up 2 or 3 steps later, quietly, on a price tag you didn't expect. Then there's the supply chain itself, more fragile than most people realize until something disrupts it. A single point of failure, whether it's a factory slowdown, a weather event blocking a major route, or a sudden shift in consumer demand, can ripple outward for weeks. We've seen it before. A hurricane in one region empties shelves in another, hundreds of miles away, because trucks got rerouted or a warehouse ran behind. And consumer behavior plays its own role. When people sense scarcity, even mild scarcity, buying patterns shift fast. It's not panic, it's just human nature. People buy a little extra just in case, and that alone can turn a minor supply hiccup into a very real, very local shortage. None of this is about predicting disaster. It's about understanding a pattern that's shown up again and again and using that pattern to make smarter decisions before everyone else is scrambling for the same shelf. Have you noticed prices creeping up on things you never used to think twice about? That's exactly where this list begins. 13. Over-the-counter medications. Pain relievers, antihistamines, cold and flu remedies, antacids, fever reducers. These are the quiet essentials that almost nobody thinks about until the moment they're needed and the bottle turns out to be empty. Unlike food or water, medication rarely gets a dedicated spot on anyone's shopping list. It's the thing tossed in the cart almost as an afterthought, which is exactly why so many households end up running short at the worst possible time. For older adults, this matters more than it might first appear. Chronic discomfort, joint pain, seasonal allergies, arthritis flare-ups, these aren't occasional inconveniences for a lot of people. They're part of a daily routine, and running out of the medication that manages them doesn't just mean one uncomfortable day. It can unravel an entire week, especially if a trip to the pharmacy isn't simple or immediate. What many households don't realize is how predictable the demand pattern actually is. During flu seasons that hit harder than forecasters expected, certain aisles have thinned out noticeably. Children's formulations and senior-specific dosing especially, since those tend to be produced in smaller batches than standard adult versions. Families who assumed the pharmacy would always have what they needed sometimes found themselves driving to 2 or 3 stores just to find the right bottle. There's a financial angle here too. Store brand versions, bought calmly in advance, are almost always priced lower than name brand versions grabbed in a hurry during a bad flu week when urgency tends to override comparison shopping entirely. A modest, rotating supply, checked periodically for expiration dates, means never facing a rough week without relief already sitting in the cabinet. There's another category of medication-related preparedness that matters even more than this one, and we'll get to it shortly. But first, something a lot of households completely overlook. 12. Pet food. It's easy to forget the pet when planning for the household. Most preparedness checklists focus on people, food, water, medication, and the family dog or cat gets mentally filed under, "we'll figure it out." But for a huge number of seniors, a pet isn't a minor detail in the household. It's companionship. Sometimes it's the only steady, predictable presence in a home that's otherwise gone quiet. And that changes how much this particular item actually matters. What many households don't realize is that pet food follows nearly the same disruption pattern as human groceries. It just doesn't get the same attention. When supply chains slow down, pet food doesn't get prioritized the way baby formula or bottled water does. It simply sits further down the list, which means it often takes longer to come back once it's gone. That delay becomes especially noticeable with specialty and prescription pet foods. During past supply disruptions, these formulations were consistently among the hardest items to restock, sometimes taking weeks longer to reappear on shelves than standard grocery staples. For a pet managing a health condition, that's not a minor inconvenience. An abrupt diet change can trigger its own complications, from digestive upset to more serious issues. A rotating supply solves this quietly and simply. Buying a few weeks ahead, rather than restocking the moment the bag runs low, means never being forced into an emergency substitution. There's a budget advantage too. Larger bags purchased during regular sales cycles consistently cost less per pound than smaller bags grabbed reactively, savings that add up meaningfully over a year, especially for households with more than one pet. Which of these items do you already keep stocked without even thinking about it? For pet owners, this one often gets missed entirely, right up until it's needed most. 11. Canned proteins: tuna, chicken, beans. Canned protein rarely gets much attention on a normal shopping trip. It sits quietly on the shelf, unglamorous, easy to overlook in favor of whatever's fresh in the meat case that week. But the moment the freezer stops working or fresh meat prices climb higher than the budget allows, that quiet little can suddenly becomes one of the most valuable items in the pantry. What many households don't realize is just how much nutritional ground these cans actually cover. Canned tuna, chicken, and beans aren't empty calories or filler food. They deliver real protein, real staying power in a meal, and in the case of beans, meaningful fiber as well. And unlike fresh meat, they store for years without refrigeration, sitting patiently in a cabinet until they're genuinely needed. There's a consumer pattern here worth noticing. During past periods when meat prices spiked noticeably, canned protein sales rose right alongside them as households quietly adjusted their weekly shopping habits to compensate. It wasn't dramatic, it was practical. People simply shifted a portion of their protein budget towards something shelf-stable and dependable without making a big deal of it. That's the real advantage of building a rotating shelf of canned protein. When fresh options become limited, expensive, or simply inconvenient to get to, meals stay balanced instead of falling apart. A can of chicken becomes a quick soup. A can of beans becomes the backbone of a hearty stew. Nothing about dinner has to change dramatically just because the grocery trip didn't go as planned. And the financial case holds up on its own. Purchased during sales and rotated properly, oldest cans used first, canned protein is almost always cheaper per serving than fresh meat, sometimes by a significant margin. This next item follows similar logic, but it touches something even more fundamental to a household's daily rhythm. 10. Cooking oil. Cooking oil is one of those items nobody thinks about until the bottle runs dry halfway through a recipe. It sits on the counter or in the pantry, unremarkable, easy to assume it'll always just be there at roughly the same price it was last time. But oil has a track record that surprises a lot of households once they actually look at it. A history of price swings that seem to come out of nowhere, at least from the perspective of someone standing in a local grocery aisle. What many households don't realize is how far the supply chain behind a bottle of cooking oil actually stretches. Oil is tied directly to global agricultural markets, crop yields, planting seasons, and growing conditions in countries most shoppers will never think about while filling a cart. That means a disruption thousands of miles away, something that has nothing to do with local weather or local stores, can still show up as a higher price tag at the neighborhood supermarket months later. That's exactly the pattern seen during past agricultural disruptions overseas. Cooking oil prices in American grocery stores rose noticeably within a matter of months. And because the cause was so far removed from anything visible locally, a lot of households were caught genuinely off guard. There was no local news story to explain it. The price simply climbed. A modest backup supply smooths that volatility out considerably. It doesn't need to be excessive, just enough to absorb a price spike without it disrupting weekly meal planning. And the financial logic is straightforward. Buying during a price dip, rather than reactively once prices have already climbed, protects against exactly the kind of sudden increase that's happened before and will likely happen again. Now we start moving into items that matter a little more, the ones that affect not just meals, but health and hygiene. 9. Toilet paper and paper products. This one barely needs an introduction. Most people already remember exactly what happened the last time this particular aisle emptied out. The images of bare shelves, the news segments, the slightly uneasy feeling of watching something so ordinary suddenly become impossible to find. It stayed in the cultural memory for a reason. What makes paper products unique on this list is that the shortage rarely starts with an actual supply problem. Few items trigger the kind of rapid, highly visible consumer reaction that toilet paper does, and that reaction is exactly why it disappears fastest. The moment people see empty shelves, or even hear a rumor of empty shelves, buying accelerates, not because anyone genuinely needs 6 months of supply, but because nobody wants to be the one left without it. That's precisely what played out during a recent, widely reported shortage. Paper product shelves emptied within days across much of the country, and by most accounts, the root cause wasn't a fundamental production shortfall, it was a wave of consumer buying that fed on itself, each person's reaction amplifying the next person's urgency. Manufacturers were producing roughly the same amount as always. It was demand, not supply, that broke the system. A steady, modest backstock is the simplest possible defense against this pattern. It doesn't need to be dramatic, just enough to comfortably ride out a few unpredictable weeks without ever becoming part of that scramble. There's a straightforward budget case here too. Buying in bulk during regular sales cycles rather than during a panic consistently avoids the inflated prices that tend to appear the moment demand spikes and stores start rationing per customer limits. Have you noticed how quickly this particular aisle can empty even when nothing is objectively wrong in the supply chain? That pattern is worth remembering because the next few items on this list follow it closely. 8. Hand sanitizer and disinfecting supplies. Hygiene products follow almost the exact same panic buying pattern as paper goods. Shelves that look completely normal one week and picked clean the next, driven by the same wave of collective urgency. But there's an added layer here that pushes this item slightly higher on the list, and it has to do with timing rather than just consumer behavior. For older adults managing existing health vulnerabilities, disinfecting supplies aren't just a convenience during flu season. They're a genuine line of defense. And that matters because of a frustrating pattern that keeps repeating itself. These items become hardest to find at exactly the moment they matter most. Nobody stocks up on hand sanitizer during a quiet, healthy month. Demand surges the instant illness starts spreading through a community, which is precisely when shelves start looking bare. What many households don't realize is how consistent this pattern has been. During past flu and illness seasons, disinfecting wipes and hand sanitizer became difficult to find in many stores for weeks at a stretch, not because manufacturers stopped producing them, but because demand spiked all at once in the exact same narrow window across an entire region simultaneously. By the time most people realized they needed extra, the shelf was already empty. Having a modest supply on hand well before that window opens means never having to compromise on hygiene during exactly the moments it carries the most weight. When a household member is already vulnerable and exposure risk is already elevated. There's a financial upside too. Stocking up during the off-season, when nobody else is thinking about it, reliably avoids the price surges that follow almost every outbreak headline when demand outpaces supply and prices climb accordingly. There's a reason this item ranks above paper goods, and it has everything to do with what comes next. 7. Prescription medication backup plans. This item needs a clear caveat right up front. It isn't about hoarding controlled substances or working around a doctor's guidance. It's about something far more modest and far more responsible. Having an honest conversation with a physician or pharmacist about building in a small, medically appropriate buffer wherever one is reasonably possible. For seniors managing ongoing health conditions, this isn't a preference, it's closer to a necessity. A disruption in medication access doesn't register as a minor inconvenience the way a delayed grocery order might. For someone managing blood pressure, heart rhythm, thyroid function, or any number of chronic conditions, even a short gap can carry real consequences. What many households don't realize is that this risk isn't hypothetical. During past supply chain disruptions, certain generic medications experienced genuine temporary shortages, not due to any single dramatic event, but from a combination of manufacturing slowdowns, ingredient sourcing issues, and distribution delays. Patients and pharmacists were left scrambling to track down alternatives, sometimes calling multiple pharmacies across town just to fill a routine prescription. The preparedness benefit here is simple and collaborative, rather than something a household manages alone. Talking to a healthcare provider about a slightly larger supply where medically appropriate and permitted by insurance can prevent that exact scramble later, turning a potential crisis into a non-event. There's a financial angle worth knowing about too. Mail-order pharmacy programs often provide 90-day supplies at a meaningfully lower per-dose cost than repeated monthly refills, which means this kind of buffer can actually save money rather than cost extra. Would your household be comfortable if a medication refill were delayed by even a week or two? For a lot of people, that question quietly reframes everything else on this list. 6. Non-perishable milk and dairy alternatives. Shelf-stable milk, powdered milk, and dairy alternatives rarely get much attention in a normal shopping routine. They sit quietly on a lower shelf, overshadowed by the cold case full of fresh options just a few aisles over. Most households don't think about them at all until fresh dairy becomes harder to find or harder to afford, and suddenly that overlooked shelf becomes the only reliable option left. What many households don't realize is just how fragile fresh dairy actually is within the broader supply chain. It's one of the more perishable staples in a typical kitchen, which means it's also one of the first categories affected the moment transportation slows down. Unlike canned goods or dry staples, fresh milk can't simply sit in a warehouse waiting for a delayed truck. It has a short window, and when that window closes, it closes for the whole supply chain at once. That vulnerability showed up clearly during certain regional supply disruptions. Fresh dairy products were among the first items to see reduced availability, precisely because they can't be stockpiled the way shelf-stable goods can. Meanwhile, the powdered and shelf-stable alternatives sitting quietly on that lower shelf held completely steady, unaffected by the same transportation slowdown, causing empty space in the refrigerated section just a few feet away. A modest backup of shelf-stable dairy solves this quietly. Breakfast routines, baking, cooking, none of it has to pause just because fresh milk didn't make it onto the delivery truck that week. There's a financial upside too, one that often surprises people. Shelf-stable versions typically cost less per unit than fresh dairy, and because they don't spoil in the same tight timeline, they generate far less waste, no more pouring out milk that turned before it could be used. We're closing in on the items that matter most now, and this next one surprises a lot of people. 4. Manual tools and non-electric backups. A manual can opener, a battery-free crank radio, a simple way to heat food without relying on a stove or microwave. These items rarely get a second thought until the moment every electric alternative fails at exactly the same time, and that moment tends to arrive without much warning. What many households don't realize is just how thoroughly modern daily life has been built around electric convenience. Electric can openers, induction cooktops, digital radios, electric kettles. These small conveniences are so seamlessly woven into a normal routine that their absence barely registers as a possibility. That's exactly why a power disruption can affect far more than just the lights. It quietly removes the tools behind dozens of small daily tasks all at once, tasks most people haven't thought about since the appliance was first purchased. That gap becomes obvious fast during an extended outage. Past events have shown a consistent pattern. Households with manual backups for basic tasks, opening a can of soup, preparing a simple meal, staying informed through a battery-free radio, managed noticeably more comfortably than neighbors without them. It wasn't about having more supplies. It was about having tools that simply didn't care whether the grid was working. There's another advantage that often gets overlooked here. These tools don't degrade in storage the way batteries or food eventually do. A manual can opener bought today will work exactly the same way in 20 years, sitting untouched in a drawer the entire time. And the financial case is about as simple as it gets on this entire list. Most manual tools are inexpensive one-time purchases, a few dollars, occasionally a bit more for a quality hand crank radio that quietly lasts for years, if not decades, without ever needing to be replaced or resupplied. This next item is one that history shows gets overlooked again and again, right up until it's desperately needed. 3. A reliable cash reserve. This isn't about stacks of bills hidden under a mattress, and it isn't about distrust in banks or the broader financial system. It's something far simpler and far more practical. Keeping a modest amount of accessible cash in small, usable denominations set aside to cover essentials for a short stretch if electronic payment systems suddenly stop working. What many households don't realize is how tightly card payments and ATMs are tied to the same electrical and network infrastructure as everything else. A power outage or a regional system disruption doesn't just dim the lights, it can shut down card readers and ATMs across an entire area simultaneously, even when the store itself is fully open, fully stocked, and perfectly willing to sell what's on its shelves. That exact scenario has played out during various regional outages. Stores remained open, generators sometimes keeping the lights and registers running, but the payment network itself was down. Customers who showed up with nothing but a debit card found themselves standing in a fully stocked store, completely unable to buy anything at all, while the handful of shoppers carrying cash walked out with exactly what they needed. A modest cash reserve solves this instantly and without complication. It doesn't need to be a large sum, just enough to cover a few days of essentials, kept somewhere secure and easy to access without notice. There's an important distinction worth understanding here. This isn't a strategy for saving money the way bulk buying or off-season shopping is elsewhere on this list. It's a strategy for making sure the money a household already has remains genuinely usable in every situation, regardless of what the power grid or payment networks happen to be doing that day. We're almost at the top of the list now, and the next item combines nearly every lesson covered so far. 2. A 2-week rotating food supply. This isn't about a bunker's worth of supplies, and it isn't about filling a basement with enough food to last a year. It's something far more manageable, a genuine 2-week rotation of shelf-stable meals that a household actually eats, made up of ordinary groceries used and replaced continuously rather than sitting untouched and forgotten. What many households don't realize is how much ground 2 weeks actually covers. It's not an arbitrary number. It's a window that comfortably absorbs the vast majority of realistic disruptions, weather events, supply slowdowns, temporary income gaps, a stretch where getting to the store simply isn't convenient, without requiring the kind of extreme stockpiling that leads to waste, clutter, and food quietly expiring in the back of a cabinet. There's a consumer behavior pattern worth noting here too. Households that maintained a rotating 2-week supply during past disruptions consistently reported far less stress and far fewer emergency store trips than those buying reactively, day to day, always one grocery run behind whatever was happening. It wasn't that they had dramatically more food. It was that they never found themselves needing something immediately and not having it. That's really the core of why this habit matters more than almost anything else on the list. It buys time. Times to wait out a temporary shortage instead of panicking through it. Time to find reasonable alternatives if something specific is unavailable. Time to simply avoid the inflated prices that follow every rush on a grocery store shelf. In a real sense, this single habit smooths out nearly every other item already covered. The financial case is just as strong. Rotating stock, purchased steadily during regular sales cycles rather than assembled all at once during a scare, consistently costs less than reactive shopping ever does during an actual shortage. And that brings us to the one item that experienced households consistently say matters more than any other. 1. A written household emergency plan. This last item isn't a product. It can't be bought, boxed, or stacked on a shelf next to the batteries and canned goods. But consistently, across every genuine preparedness conversation, it turns out to be the single most overlooked item on the entire list, and the one that quietly determines whether everything else covered in this video actually works when it matters. Here's the uncomfortable truth many households don't realize until it's too late. All the supplies in the world don't help much if nobody knows where they are. A closet full of batteries, water, canned protein, and first aid supplies means very little if, in the middle of an actual emergency, family members are searching the house, calling each other confused, unsure who's responsible for what, or what step actually comes first. What many households don't realize is just how measurable this gap really is. In surveys conducted after past disruptions, a clear pattern emerged. Families with even a simple written plan, something as basic as a single page noting where supplies are kept, who calls whom, and what the first 3 steps look like, consistently reported feeling calmer and more in control than families without one. And notably, this held true regardless of how well stocked either household actually was. A moderately prepared family with a clear plan often felt more confident than a heavily stocked family without one. That's really the entire value of this final item. A written plan turns 14 separate supplies into a coordinated system, rather than a pile of useful things nobody quite knows how to use under stress. It's the difference between a household that reacts and a household that simply executes. And perhaps most importantly, it costs nothing but a bit of time to put together, yet it multiplies the value of every single item already covered in this video, turning a stockpile into an actual plan. None of this is about fear. It's about recognizing a pattern that's shown up again and again in past shortages, past outages, past disruptions, and using that pattern to make quiet, sensible decisions before everyone else is scrambling for the same shelf. Every item on this list shares the same underlying purpose: buying time, reducing stress, and protecting the people who depend on you. From batteries to a written plan, the theme is the same. Preparedness isn't about predicting the worst. It's about making sure the worst, if it ever comes, is just an inconvenience instead of a crisis. You're not panicking, you're preparing. And that distinction is exactly what separates a stressful week from a manageable one. If you found this helpful, let us know in the comments which item on this list you already have covered and which one surprised you. And if you'd like more practical preparedness insights like this one, consider subscribing for future videos.